You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Today, we're talking about voting and whether it's the right thing to do. The comedian Russell Brand says he has never voted. In a television interview, he said the act of voting shows tacit approval of a political system that he says is destroying the planet, creating enormous wealth disparity, and ignoring the needs of most people. He said he wanted to see fundamental change, including massive wealth redistribution and less of a focus on profit, and he argued that this would arrive sooner if more people stopped voting. The interview struck a chord, spawning a plethora of opinions both supporting and opposing Brand's position. Many criticised Brand for failing to propose a coherent alternative to the current system, while another comedian, Robert Webb, told him to read some Orwell. But the sheer quantity of debate appears to show widespread uncertainty over whether Western-style democratic capitalism is working, and, if not, whether engaging with it more, or disengaging completely, is the best way to improve things. Well, this, no less, is what my guests are here to tell us. I'm joined by Will Bancroft, a Huffington Post blogger and tech finance entrepreneur, Phil Scullion, a political journalist and contributor to the website politics.co.uk, and Jonathan Birdwell, head of the Citizenship and Political Participation Programme at the think tank Demos. Well, I want to start, in a nutshell, by asking you all, yes or no, is Russell Brand right? Should we stop voting? Will Bancroft?
No, I don't think we're going to change anything by sitting back as slacktivists. I think if we want some change or disruptions we talk about in enterprise, we need to get involved and change things from the bottom up.
Phil Scullion.
I would agree with that. I think Brand's rejection of voting is relatively lazy, to be honest. I think that the best way to change something is to get involved and to go out and vote.
Jonathan Birdwell.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to agree. It'd be one thing if he was just making this point we were talking before about, would he have received as much coverage? Would we be talking about this if he had said the same things but actually said go out and vote? Was the controversial thing the fact that he said don't go out and vote? And so, just the fact that we're talking about this is good. But I think that specific message, no, of course not. You have to, we can't, yes, young people in general these days are kind of looking for other avenues in which to express political preferences, but we cannot lose the fundamental expression of democracy, which is the vote.
Will Bancroft, is there any merit to what Russell Brand has been saying?
Some of it. I think I'm going to agree with what the rest of the guests have just said, that this news bubble, the Brand-Paxman political theatre that it was, is good because, we are thinking about these issues, politics, economics, etc. I agree with him when he identifies certain issues in society, where, political apathy, lack of engagement with the cosy Westminster consensus, etc. But I think there are ways to change it. So I think, in a bit like a cultural revolutionary witch doctor, he hits on some of the symptoms of the time we want to change, but I don't think he offers many prescriptions at all. So I guess that's why we're all here, to talk about what we think the prescriptions might be.
What do you think the prescriptions might be?
Well, when he comes to talking about general lack of engagement, disenchanted feeling with Westminster politics today, I agree. But I think there are a few politics out there, or politicians, I should say, from both sides, Labour, Conservative, etc., who are suggesting some things to, disrupt this cosy Westminster consensus. This lib-lab-con situation where politicians operate quite a lot of their time in a Westminster bubble, and people in communities all around the country feel detached and like they're not serving them. So I've heard mentioned open primaries is a good example to introduce more competition, choice at the local level. I think that's quite interesting. That would challenge the power structures of the two or three main parties. More regular by-elections might be another interesting thing. So politicians don't get in and then serve a 5-year term in the sort of cosy confines of Westminster, towing the party line to further their own career. They have far more regular interaction with the voter base who are saying, yep, you're doing a good job or you're not. We're going to take away your mandate or we're going to give you more time to carry on.
What are open primaries?
Essentially where it allows far more parties to challenge at the local level. So anyone can put themselves up to say, we want to serve for our local community for these regions. We think these are the main issues, etc., etc. It's a system which I say used a lot more in the States. If it's good enough for Barack Obama, it has some appeal for me here. And really it allows far more candidate exposure or choice at the local level. So local people don't just get three main parties and a few other relevancies to have a look at.
Jonathan Birdwell, at Demos, are you observing an increasing disengagement with politics?
Yes, in some ways. If you look at younger generations, if you look at the British population as a whole in terms of surveys, do you tend to trust political parties? Are you satisfied with the state of democracy in the UK? There are increasing levels of dissatisfaction with democracy, increasing levels of distrust with political parties. 82% now of the British population say they do not trust political parties, which is extraordinary. But on the other hand, I think we're also seeing, and it's being driven by these feelings of dissatisfaction, the emergence of these kind of populist groups, both on the far right and the far left, not only in the UK, but also across Europe, really, and in the US as well, that are trying to channel this dissatisfaction and that are using social media in interesting new ways to organize and get a message out there very quickly. The Facebook profiles of these populist parties have more likes and membership on social media websites than traditional political parties do. So I think, yes, the distrust and dissatisfaction is on the rise, but we're also seeing, democracy kind of responding to that flexibly through the development of these populist groups. And you might disagree with what they advocate. You might argue that actually they're very simplistic messages, and that's what I would suggest. But nonetheless, they are representing an avenue for people to express their dissatisfaction in a much more healthy way, as we should do in a democracy, as opposed to just saying, don't engage at all, don't vote, there's nothing we can do. That's that.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Today we're talking about voting and whether it's the right thing to do. I'm joined by Will Bancroft, a tech finance entrepreneur, Phil Scullion, a political journalist, and Jonathan Birdwell, head of the Citizenship and Political Participation Programme at the think tank Demos. Phil Scullion, how would you sort of compare and contrast these two avenues? On the one hand, you've got Russell Brand saying, don't vote. And on the other hand, you have the rise of what are being deemed sort of niche, populist, political parties. Not everybody agrees that they're necessarily a positive force. For example, what would Britain governed by UKIP look like? What is the Italian comedian Beppe Grillo's five-star party achieving? Are these fringe parties a more desirable future than whatever it is that Russell Brand is hoping for?
I think there's something positive about the fact UKIP are engaging with a debate, and there are a lot of people in the UK who feel very, very strongly on Europe, and so I think it's a very good thing that UKIP have stepped up to give those people more of a voice. Coming back to Russell Brand, I think one of the real problems with Russell Brand, I'll slightly break the consensus here, I think it's good in a sense that we're having this debate. What I worry about is that Russell Brand is very much viewed as a voice of popular culture and a voice for younger people. And I think there's something slightly irresponsible about stepping up and saying, young people, don't vote. Because the important thing is that we encourage young people to engage. And I don't see how Russell Brand's intervention is actually going to encourage that at all. I think it's going to have a negative effect on that.
You mean fewer people will vote?
Obviously, I wouldn't necessarily attribute that much weight to what Russell Brand has said, but I mean, it's hugely popular. I mean, I think the amount of views on YouTube, the amount of stir that it's caused, I think that could potentially discourage people from voting. It could, in some ways, reinforce people's view that politics doesn't work for them.
But why do people have that view in the first place?
I think people have that view for a whole variety of different reasons, and it's a view which I disagree with. I think politics does work for people. I think politics makes real change. And I mean, an example, for instance, would be in the US, Obamacare is a big change. People have voted for that change. So I would view that as an example of democracy in action.
But at the same time, while you have Obamacare, you also have various other problems, which is the sort of thing that Russell Brand is pointing to, growing wealth gap, environmentally destructive policies, and ultimately, potentially, growing impoverishment of large swathes of the population. This, he says, is a problem, and voting, he says, is basically propping up the system that is leading to that. So, in a sense, he really is engaging with what he sees as reality as it is, and if it's striking a chord, that's because a lot of people agree with him, is it not?
I think it does strike a chord, but I think Russell Brand makes a slight mistake there from a utopian perspective, that what he's comparing the current system to is a utopian ideal. He's not comparing it to an alternative. He's not presented an alternative. He's not actually comparing it to how the world was 100, 200 years ago, because I think the world nowadays, if you're born in the UK in 2013, you're very lucky. And I mean, actually, if you're born in many places in 2013, you're probably slightly better off than if you'd have been born there a couple of hundred years ago.
Will Bancroft, is that right? Do we not know how lucky we are?
In some ways, yes. And I think this is where I had some opinions on the brand thing, mainly from an economic point of view. He talks about inequality of income, etc., etc. Now, that is a trend that we've seen in the US, in Europe, and the UK, and the developed world over the last 30, 40, 50 years as a smaller elite of society have collected more and more of the wealth. Economists have different views about that. I held my views from a slightly niche, I'd say slightly marginalised school of economics, the Austrian school. I would attribute some of these problems to fiat money, which is essentially government intervention and manipulation of money printing, as you might call it. I would say that this phenomenon is actually redistributive in its outcome, and it takes money from Main Street, the regions, from the peripheries, back to the centre, back to the people closest to the source of the money. So if you look at your average worker in a factory on Main Street in America, American Joe, or in the UK, his lot in life, although still being pretty good in relative terms, hasn't made much of an advancement, or has gone down in real terms if you account for inflation the last 30 or 40 years. Whereas the real power brokers in the economy, the people with access to huge amounts of debt, the people closest to the money printing, have done hugely well. So that was one of my suggestions in a HuffPost article to Brand. Different economic thinkers will disagree about that or agree. That would be one of my humble prescriptions.
Jonathan Birdwell, do you agree with that? Is the fundamental problem one of economics and sort of geopolitical shifts in economic power rather than of political system, do you think?
I think that's certainly a huge aspect to it all. But I do think there's issues with the political system as well. And we talk about why is this kind of growing distrust, dissatisfaction. And I think two points really. First is that, in the past 10 years, because of the advancements to technology, we've seen, massive disruption and change to a huge number of industries in our retail, music, movies, the rise of the internet. These are having huge changes to various institutions that we've known and how they operate. And yet it hasn't quite touched politics, at least not in Western society. We talked about how we can kind of have a kind of digital democracy, but in any kind of fundamental way that you would see in the other industries, we're not seeing that same change. That has to be taken into account. Whether that change is in fact possible, I think that's something that Brand is trying to explore, and that's what other people would try and argue as well, that it is possible. I just don't think you should throw out some of the fundamental aspects of democracy like he did. The other point I would make is that I think we have a kind of social impatience. We have a real impatience with change nowadays. We're on a 24-hour news cycle. We expect, again, because of shifts to technology and the other industries that we can shape the world to ourselves, very high levels of convenience. We expect things, and yet politics is messy. Tackling huge issues like inequality can't be done overnight, and I think a lot of people get impatient with that and then assume that the system fails, when actually a government is like a giant ship. You can't just immediately do a U-turn, but just the smallest little change in degree of direction will actually end up having a huge impact down the line. So it's important, I think, that we have realistic and make sure young people have realistic expectations about what government can achieve. Sure, be ambitious, think outside the box, but also be realistic.
Phil Scullion, do you agree with that? Do you think that politicians are doing all they can in a very difficult situation, or are they not proving equal to the challenges that we face?
There's a real difference. Some politicians are, some politicians perhaps aren't. I think one thing I would agree with Russell Brand on, and actually for me this is something which made his article and his interview on Newsnight so frustrating, is that there are things which he is right about. I mean, certainly he spoke at length about the idea that Boris Johnson, David Cameron, all these politicians from across the political divide all went to the same kind of schools, they went to the same kind of the same backgrounds, and the way that the House of Parliament looks very much like those schools. It's very much designed for that cosy kind of elite, which we've already spoken about. So I think that there are real changes to be made, and there should be real pressure on politicians to make those changes. But again, I think it's an easy solution to say, well, those changes aren't happening, so we should throw everything out. Instead, you need to engage, and if you are someone from a more disadvantaged background, you need to find a way to get your voice heard and to get yourself into politics and hopefully change it. I mean, and the only way that politics will change is if people engage and change it themselves.
But this is a kind of an interesting question, isn't it? You know, some people have said if you disengage with politics, then it's less likely that your concerns and your needs will be represented by politicians. But isn't that a fundamental failing on the part of politicians? Because if their responsibility is to create a society which works well for as many people as possible, then they should be thinking about everybody, not just those who vote for them.
I would agree that is a problem for politicians, but it's not hugely surprising. And I mean, people often talk about the fact that pensioners are well treated because pensioners go out and vote. If you want to solve that problem, I'm not quite sure how you go about doing that other than by encouraging people to go out and vote and encouraging different groups to go out and vote. And that's the exact opposite of what Russell Brand has done. So I don't really see how he offers a solution to that problem.
All right, I want to ask you, what do you think the consequences of large-scale non-voting would be?
If the amount of people voting falls below a certain level, then obviously politicians will need to reform how they're appealing to voters in an attempt to bring it up again so that they've got democratic legitimacy. One thing I would point out, though, is that Russell Brand says voting would be tacit consent with the current system. I actually think he's completely wrong. The easiest way to tacitly consent to the system and to prop up the current system is not voting. Because if you don't go out and vote, then politicians can do whatever they like. You're choosing not to have your interests represented.
Will Bancroft, could not voting be seen as the ultimate form of engagement, do you think? If you don't vote, if people don't vote, then that really will put the scarers on politicians because it will convince them that they are not deemed legitimate rulers of the country, if you like.
No, I'm with Phil here. Again, I don't align myself with Brand's comments. I think you get the leaders you deserve, you get the leaders you vote for. And, you know, Brand's talking about a hugely disenfranchised underclass who don't feel they've got a stake in society, don't feel they've got a voice, etc., etc. So, you know, if you're going to not get involved in the political process and choose not to have your voice heard by the people in power so they can't respond to any of your needs and opinions, you're kind of saying, okay, well, we're going to create some sort of revolution. I mean, is it a revolution of apathy, just sat on the sideline doing nothing? Well, that's not going to change anything. So the only thing I can see coming out of that is civil unrest, civil disobedience, people, you know, choosing to take matters into their own hands. Now, would that be a better thing compared to where we are now? I would suggest, given the militant part of the left who might have heard Brand's calls as a rallying cry, possibly not. You know, not that I'm pointing fingers at that part of the left, and there's the same constituency on the right as well. But I think the way to change this is just by getting much more active in politics at the local level. If you're feeling disenfranchised, that you're not being listened to, etc., if you're not going to make your weight count in the political process, you've got to do it somewhere else. Now, that somewhere else is a bit of a dangerous thing. That's why I think the comedians, Jonathan Webb was it you said, who commented about how Brand should read some Orwell. Yeah, I think he's right, because Brand talks about rearranging society according to his perception, his beliefs, etc. But as Paxman very carefully tried to tease out of Brand, all that means is you've got to replace one hierarchy with another. It's, you know, it's committees, bureaucracies, etc. of enlightened people trying to change things for the right reasons. But, you know, that opens us up to the old thing of, you know, people's intentions can be as good as gold. It's the outcomes and what they produce that are the important things. So I'm not hugely optimistic about replacing the system with Brand's bureaucracy, but I think we should get involved as possible at the local level.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Today we're talking about voting and whether it's the right thing to do. Jonathan Birdwell, what do you think the consequences of mass non-participation in elections would be?
Scary, isn't it? I don't think it's looking at some research that's out there. I don't think we're at a risk of that. You know, yes, voter turnout has declined, but on a couple measures, and two in particular, I want to highlight that I think Brand doesn't necessarily reflect as big a portion of society as we think. The first is that, you know, there's a survey that asks across Europe every few years or so, you know, do you think that society is generally okay as it is, the status quo? Do you think it needs reform? You know, do you think it needs change, but through gradual reforms, or do you think it needs kind of revolution overhaul? And actually, very small percentages of the population would say revolution overhaul. Less than 1 in 10. The overwhelming majority of 3/4 of people would say society needs change, but let's do it through gradual reforms. Also, we at Demos have done a lot of surveying of supporters of far-right populist groups, as I was saying, far-left populist groups. These groups are very disillusioned, very low levels of trust in various institutions, political institutions, and yet they are not as disillusioned with voting. So again, we're looking at a measure of, do you agree or disagree with the statement, it doesn't matter who I vote for? In other words, my vote is meaningless. And actually only about 16% of far-right supporters agreed with that. So again, a very small percentage. So I think most people in society still do recognize the value of voting. So he's a little bit on the kind of fringes when it comes to that. Now, I can imagine, though, a kind of lower average and us kind of accepting that, 50 is just going to be the kind of new normal. And that's because, I think we see this as well with the younger generations. They're very socially motivated and active, but they just don't think the command and control, top-down approach of traditional politics is the way to solve social problems. They're much more collaborative. They think they can tackle these issues without the machinery of government, and they might do that and be successful in doing that, in which case politicians might just be less powerful in the future than they have been in the past, but they're still going to be an important part.
But isn't that in some ways more or less what Russell Brand is calling for?
For what?
More engagement for young people, sort of bypassing the machinery of government.
Well, absolutely. And I think the problem is that he's saying don't vote as well. Absolutely. If you look at the way young people want to engage with society and how they're in the trends, absolutely they want to change the world, and they don't necessarily see traditional forms of government as the way to achieve that. And they should be encouraged. They should be encouraged in that ambition and exploration of trying to find new and interesting and innovative ways of solving the world's problems. I think the younger generation sees global problems as their own problems more than any other previous generation. They still have to vote. We still need some kind of machinery of democratic government. I think it's too easy to say, the system's failed, democracy is broken. What is the alternative? Democracy is the least worst form of government that we have. We're kind of stuck with it. Yes, absolutely encourage people to get involved outside of it and not just rely on it, but you can't throw it out as well.
Phil Scullion, at what level do you think voter turnout, if it's low, becomes a problem for democratic legitimacy?
I think voter turnout falling, as Jonathan said, I think voter turnout is around 50%. It's not ideal, but I still think that you can argue there's democratic legitimacy there. I mean, I think if it starts to fall a long way below that, 30, 40%, then it starts to become very difficult to justify.
Will Bancroft, do you agree that there is an underclass in this country that is completely excluded from the economy and from the political process?
Yeah, I do a bit, and I think it's not just in the UK, it's across Europe and in the States, and I think it's a bit of a sort of advanced economy phenomenon. Some of this, again, comes down to the economics behind it. One bit of Brand's sort of ranting that I did agree with or side with, and I think he's articulating this a bit like a lightning rod, feeling that's being felt more widely across the economy and society, is that there's too much cronyism. We've talked about top-down central planning at the moment. I would say there's a lot of top-down central planning in the economy, deciding who in certain industries succeeds or fails, etc., whether you call it bailout economics, blah, blah, blah. The problem with that is that the government and the elite are choosing who succeeds and fails. One thing that's still an issue that people are really interested in now is bankers' bonuses, the financial system, etc. During the credit crunch, you had the Federal Reserve deciding to advance liquidity to companies like Harley Davidson. People might think, well, what does that mean? That's a spurious example. Well, a central bank is deciding to assist a motorcycle manufacturer to stay in business. Now, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I mean, it's certainly top-down central planning. It's a small committee of enlightened people deciding who to help and support during bad times, etc. So I do agree with Brand in that, this sort of whole public sentiment that we're concerned about cronyism. I think in some sectors, I think finance especially, the good times are privatised, so during bull markets, bankers' bonuses, etc., etc. Fair enough if the bank are going to handle it all privately when it comes to a downturn. But during the bad times, the losses are socialised. Now, that seems like a sort of unfair dichotomy. And so I definitely agree with him there. And I think this example, goes beyond just finance. I think it affects all sorts of other markets as well. A big issue people have been talking about in the press the last week or so is the energy market, the issue of rising energy prices. I would agree with some commentators that these energy companies are acting in a slightly cartel-like behaviour, but I think the greatest threat to cartels is themselves. The cure for high prices is high prices. Other people come in and try and disrupt what they're doing because they're having too much of a good time at our expense. I think in the energy market, one of the reasons why those companies are so big and so ingrained and so difficult to disrupt is the fact that it's such a regulated sector. Regulation is a difficult thing. Sometimes it can help the consumer, but quite a lot it actually negatively impacts the consumer by meaning the really powerful, rich incumbents are best placed to employ all those lawyers to jump through the compliance loopholes, to meet all these capital adequacy requirements to be a bank or whatever it is. If we return to banking again, there's been so little disruption or challenge or competition to the status quo we've seen since 2008. We're 5 years plus beyond now. The only big name I can think of who's arrived to change things for the better is Vernon Hill and Metro Bank. Richard Branson's looked at the space and tried to get involved and change things and improve it for the consumer. But he's found it very difficult. It's very difficult to get a banking license. You need huge amounts of capital behind you. The barriers to entry to these new entrepreneurs are high.
All right, well, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but I just want to finish off by asking you all briefly to say, given that here in Britain we appear to be living in a time when living standards are falling, in 10 years' time, where will this debate about voting be, do you think, Jonathan Birdwell?
I think we'll be having the same debate, really. And I think we'll just continuously have this debate. But I just want to close on one point and make a challenge, actually, to Russell Brand, which is, if you really care about these issues and you think that traditional government isn't the way to achieve it, then set an example and give away 75% of your salary. If you really care about these issues, and you called for a kind of social egalitarian kind of utopia. Well, look at France. They have that and the issues caused there. But he doesn't need to, set an example, and then others perhaps will follow you, because until you do that, I think you're subject to potential criticism.
Phil Scullion, in 10 years' time, where will we be?
There are a couple of things on the agenda which may engage people. I mean, I think the vote over Scotland is going to be an example of politics making a huge difference to the state of the UK. And I think as well, if we have a vote on Europe, that may also engage people. But unfortunately, it will likely be very similar in 10 years' time. And I would also agree with the challenge to Russell Brand that if he
redistribute your own wealth. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say as well, I mean, if he wants to make a real difference, then stand for Parliament, go and do the boring stuff, go and hand out leaflets, and because otherwise he's standing on the side giving out sound bites, but he's not actually making a real difference.
Will Bancroft, in 10 years' time, some disruption, but not to the system of voting, you think?
Do you know, I'm actually more optimistic about this. I think technology and the internet is the great enabler here. It enables us to sort of spread our ideas, congregate, commune in ways that were far more effective than we had previously. I think actually this will apply much more pressure to the power bases of the three major parties in the UK, and hopefully to parties in America and Europe, etc. So I'm actually quite a bit more optimistic about that. I know some politicians talk about a potential I-democracy in the future, and I can see that happening. In terms of what the other guys have just said about Brand putting his money where his mouth is, absolutely. The guy's gifted. He's put lots of value into the market, and people have rewarded him with DVD sales, comedy show sales, etc. Come on, Russ, let's see you put 75% of your money into social causes, whatever it is.
All right, that was Will Bancroft, a Huffington Post blogger and tech finance entrepreneur. I was also joined by Phil Scullion, a political journalist and contributor to the website politics.co.uk, and Jonathan Birdwell, head of the Citizenship and Political Participation Programme at the think tank Demos. Thank you all very much.